The government is in scramble mode at the moment. They're trying to save enough money so that they can give us all tax cuts. That was an election promise. But some general questions about the tax system, about not only how much you and I, what's referred to as the squeezed middle, are paying, but is it fair to those who have less? Is it fair to those who have a lot more? And is it fair that churches in particular don't have to pay tax? Now, a conversation earlier this month, the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, indicated that he would be interested or open into looking at whether or not churches should be taxed, should their tax-exempt status be revoked. Somebody certainly with a vested interest in this topic is Senior Pastor of Windsor Park Baptist Church, Rev Grant Harris. Kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time today.
Yeah, kia ora, Andrew. Thanks. Nice to be here.
It is, I suppose, an important question. You know, we want to be fair and equitable, and I think it comes as a shock and surprise to those who have very little understanding of what happens in churches or what they do with the money, that churches don't pay tax, but they have to. Death and taxes are a certainty unless, of course, you've got charitable status and then you can do what you want with all the money. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but that's perhaps how some people see it.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's been brought about probably by a minority voice within the country, but also with really not a lot of thought around the implications or actually how the tax system works. As I've often gone in debate publicly to say, yeah, maybe churches should pay tax, because the reality is, for most of us in the industry, I mean, tax is not on income, tax is on surplus or slash profit, to which churches generally don't ever make anything. So the tax take would be very small to start with, even if it was implemented. So I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I think in some ways it's not necessarily a church tax that people are looking for, but hey, let's put a label on it. It's a destiny tax. It's a tax on the sorts of churches that people don't like. It's those big mega churches that drive fancy cars that I can't afford. It's what the government actually described as a jealousy tax, really.
Yeah.
Those people should be taxed because they have more money than me.
I guess this is the world that we live in, and sometimes a minority voice is the one that gets the attention within the media. So obviously Destiny gets its fair share of media attention, to which 99.9% of other churches don't. So I think that's probably a valid comment. But obviously a charitable like sanitarium gets in the news normally every year when it releases its profit figures. So, you know, that gets its fair share of attention as well on an annual basis for many years now.
Certainly. And that's a little bit of an anomaly, because people think, why shouldn't the guys that make Weet-Bix and sell them in the supermarkets, and they're a lot more expensive than they used to be, why shouldn't they pay tax? But it fits under that charitable status because it's run and owned by a church?
Yes, totally. And I think one of the misconceptions that people also don't understand in the wider society will be around the charitable sector. Actually, the comment that the Prime Minister made around taxing churches was in the context. He also added that he was open to looking at the broader charitable taxation regime, of which there are 28,000 charities. And so I've kind of always thought that as much as they talk about taxing churches, well, they actually can't discriminate against churches under the Human Rights Act. So when they start talking about taxing churches, really what they should be talking about, and maybe as churches we should be a little bit more open about this as well, is saying we should be talking about the charitable sector, 28,000 different charities, including all of our universities, including lots of businesses, the Ngāi Tahu Group or the Right Family Charitable Group, who run big organizations in our country, are also charitable. So I guess for me, the equity around that is to say, it's not just churches. You can't discriminate against churches under the Human Rights Act. So let's talk about the charitable sector. And maybe that is a conversation that should be held, but people need to understand the scope of what that means.
Is it a legitimate reason not to pay tax, or is it just a tax dodge, I suppose people are asking? And this is, are we set up as a charity so that we wouldn't have to pay tax, rather than actually churches have always been seen as charities for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and looking at the significant good that they do in society. Now, perhaps people without faith wouldn't recognise that, but I mean, let's take the obvious example. The Salvation Army don't have to pay tax, but I don't think the government could afford to pay for the services they provide with the tax that they would get from them if they were taxed.
Yes, and another very current example that people would appreciate would be the St. John's Foundation.
Yeah.
Our ambulance services is a charity, and in 2023, they made a surplus, according to the Charities Commission, of $1.1 million. Now,
Yeah.
should they be paying tax on that surplus? I think most people would say, no, they're a great service to the community. And some people would say, well, the government should be funding St. John's, our ambulance service. And that is a live discussion as well. But they are a charity on the same foundations as any other charity.
What do you think would happen if churches, for example, in this example, lost their charitable status? Because I kind of get the feeling on this one, Grant, that the good that churches do in the community isn't because it's a tax dodge. It's because of what Jesus asked us to do. If we didn't get the tax benefits, we'd just do it anyway.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. And the reality is that a lot of churches do pay tax through PAYE. Even in the charitable sector, churches would employ thousands of people across the country. So we aren't exempt from all of those taxes. And I guess my argument would be, as I would often say to people, is remember, taxes paid on surplus. I couldn't think of many churches in my experience, and I've been around a while, who make big surpluses, who would make much of a tax liability to start with. So even if they brought it in for churches, which I don't think the government can do, I don't think it would radically alter the income generated through taxation to New Zealand. So people have to remember that it's not on income, it's on what's left over. And churches generally forever have spent what we get because we provide services and we aren't about creating surplus and profits. Generally, people would argue around the assets, which generally are just assets that have been accumulated over a long time. All of that money predominantly given by people that believe in the church or the charity, and just over time, capital growth increases with that. So it's just the reality is that churches and charities are in the same kind of boat.
And certainly the mega churches, the ones that have the easy target on their back because they have these huge facilities and staff, etc. They, I'm sure, would be able to afford some very clever tax accountants that would make sure that if they did have to pay tax, that would be extremely minimal and there'd be all sorts of legitimate expenses that they could write off, just like some other charities and a lot of corporates and family trusts and that sort of thing do as well, right?
Yeah, look, no question that would be the case. There's always a difference between tax minimization and tax evasion. There are ways to minimize tax totally. Most people do that. And I think these days in New Zealand, the joy is that there is greater regulation, greater scrutiny through the Charities Commission about what makes a charity. What are we doing with surplus money, for example, and making sure we are being true to the object. So in the last decade, the amount of scrutiny around charities has increased dramatically, and that's a healthy thing. Churches should be checking ourselves to make sure that we are doing what Jesus has called us to do, but that we are being a positive contributor to our community for the sake of Christ.
I think if we look behind the scenes of what actually is happening here with the question that was asked of the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, in the same way, I mean, Christopher Luxon is somebody who has outed himself as somebody who has a Christian faith and who attends church on a irregular basis, given some of the other commitments, time commitments that he has. And so for journalists that have different opinions, to pick a fight with them about pro-life issues, about the rainbow community, about churches' charitable tax status, this is just troublemaking journalism in some ways. And it does remind me, and look, I'm not comparing Christopher Luxon to Jesus, but it does remind me of that question that the Pharisees took to Jesus to say, should the church pay tax? Jesus, I think, had a cleverer answer than Christopher Luxon on this one.
Yeah, I think you're quite right there. And I was just thinking in my mind, I'm not sure if he's comparing himself to Jesus or not. But I do think that particular interview that he had, it's perhaps even by churches been blown just slightly out of proportion, because he did add into that discussion that he's open to looking at the broader, in his words, the broader charitable taxation regime. So he did mention churches, but he did expand that to also say the bigger picture. And like I say, that's 28,000 charities that employ about 145,000 people in our country. So it's a massive industry. So whether they actually want to do that or not, I would question. It didn't seem to come up in their mandate. So I suspect that interview interview was a little bit of clever politicizing on his part at that particular time.
But
And he did say at the end of that interview that it's not currently on their agenda.
But of course, media being media, of course, they wanted a particular soundbite. They got that, and that's what has been distributed since that time. Having said that, though, some interesting questions, some interesting, I suppose, not just theological, but financial questions for churches to ask. What if we did lose our tax status overnight? Would we keep doing what we're doing? How would that change the nature of what God has called us to do? Some broad questions, but I don't think charitable status or tax-exempt status is going to change how we go about building the kingdom of God, Grant.
Yeah, I imagine that is entirely true. I mean, foundationally for us, we talk about stewardship of the resources that we are entrusted with, either through our forebears who have perhaps bought property as we've developed that, or our current donors that give to the church. And I think that, that's open for scrutiny. And I think it's something we need to always be thinking about. We always need to be praying about that we are good managers, good stewards, as the Bible encourages us to do. And if we lost our, charitable status, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't personally feel that would change really anything. We might have to think through how we run, our back office systems a little bit differently. But, the Bible also says pay to Caesar, what is Caesar's. So if we had a tax liability to pay, we would just have to be careful around how that kind of worked and how we would structure our operations. But obviously in the bigger churches, they do generate more media attention. They can be seen to be a little bit flashier. And so I think maybe New Zealand's tall poppy syndrome plays into that perhaps a little bit as well.
It would also be interesting to see, because one of the benefits of giving to a charity is you get a third back at the end of the financial year. It would be interesting to see if churches lost their charitable status, whether or not the weekly take, as it were, with the virtual collection plate would go down, because people would go, oh, well, I'm not getting my money back anymore. But hey, that is a conversation, a theoretical conversation for another time. Grant, thanks for what you do. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, appreciate that, Andrew. Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.